devastation caused by the nuclear accident at Chernobyl is well known. But the full story of the massive effort to contain the disaster has never been told. More than 500,000 Soviet men and women risked everything, and thousands ultimately sacrificed their lives in a desperate struggle to prevent a far greater catastrophe. A second explosion, 10 times more powerful than Hiroshima, that could have wiped out half of Europe. This is the heroic and tragic story of the Battle of Chernobyl. Friday, April 25th, 1986. A beautiful spring day for the 43,000 inhabitants of Pripyat in the Ukraine. A day that will remain forever engraved in their memory. Less than 2 miles from the city, the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, where several thousand people go to work each day. Tonight, the 176 employees of Block 4 have been ordered to carry out a test on a self-fueling system of the reactor, something that could save energy. At 1:23 a.m., the security systems are deactivated and the experiment begins. A series of detonations go off in the core of the reactor. While Pripyat sleeps peacefully, the floor of the plant begins to tremble. The 1,200-ton cover of the reactor suddenly blasts into the air. An ultra-powerful stream of radioactive vapor releases uranium and graphite over hundreds of yards around the plant. From the gaping hole, a spray of fire charged with radioactive particles and fusion shoots more than 3,000 feet into the sky. The most serious nuclear accident in history has just taken place.
During the night, early in the morning, I got the call around 5 a.m. I was told there's been some accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant.
The first firemen on the scene battle the fire without adequate protective gear. They pour tons of water on this strange fire, but nothing seems capable of putting it out. They're all exposed to lethal doses of radiation. 2 men die that night. 28 more will follow in the next few months. They are the first victims of Chernobyl. By early morning, the clouds are already being contaminated by the radioactive column rising 3,000 feet into the sky. Igor Kostin was a photographer with the news agency Novosti. When a friend and a helicopter pilot offers to fly him over Chernobyl that morning, all Kostin knows is that something happened at the plant during the night. He is the first journalist to witness the gaping hole.
Держи это место! Держи! Держи! Где дым идет? Где дым?
When we flew over the block, I opened the window of the helicopter. I didn't realize then what a big mistake that was.
The thin, translucent smoke he sees rising from the ruins is in fact highly radioactive. Kostin is one of the few Chernobyl reporters on the scene in the early hours of the accident to have survived serious exposure to radiation. This is the first picture ever taken of the breach.
Once I returned to Kiev, I processed my pictures, and I noticed the negatives were black, and the colors very poor. I didn't know it yet, but the photos had been exposed to radioactivity.
At the core of the blown-up reactor, buried beneath nearly 50 feet of rubble, the graphite surrounding the nuclear fuel burns and melts the uranium. The radioactive fallout will be 100 times greater than the combined power of the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the Kremlin, 8 hours after the explosion, Gorbachev has little information on the situation.
The first information consisted of accident and fire. Not a word about an explosion. At first, I was told there hadn't been an explosion. The consequences of such false information were particularly dramatic.
Meanwhile, clouds filled with radioactive particles are being blown north by the wind. Between the 26th and the 27th of April, they drift more than 600 miles across Russia, then over Belarus and the Baltics. On the 28th, they hit Sweden, where the rise of radioactivity is detected near one of their nuclear power plants.
The Swedish Minister of Energy phoned me on the Monday, and I was in my office in Vienna, and she told me that they had measured very much increased radioactivity near our power plant in Forsmark in the east of Sweden, and they had concluded that it must have come from abroad. Did we know anything about it?
What has happened? An explosion? A radioactive cloud? Serious contamination? It was Sweden that alerted us.
The crisis continues to grow. At the bottom of the destroyed reactor, 1,200 tons of white-hot magma continue to burn at over 5,000 degrees, sending radioactive gas and dust into the atmosphere. All of Europe is at the mercy of the winds. On the third day of the crisis, Soviet General Nikolai Antochkin leads a fleet of 80 helicopters sent from Moscow to fight the blaze and put the fire out. In those days, radioactivity was measured in units called roentgens. Normal atmospheric level is about 12 millionths of a roentgen. General Antochkin is shocked by what he finds.
Our dosimeter, the instrument for measuring radiation, only went up to 500 roentgens. The needle was going crazy. It was completely off the scale. I think there were at least 1,000 roentgens at a height of 200 meters.
Even at that altitude, just a half hour of exposure could be lethal. The strong current of radioactive hot air streaming up from the reactor makes it impossible to get closer. They will have to improvise some way of carrying out their mission.
Something needed to be done as quickly as possible. Put out the fire and seal up the reactor to be able to get close enough to do other work. It also needed to be closed up to stop the radioactive dust from spreading. It was getting blown off by the wind. We really needed to act fast.
The gigantic ballet begins. Top pilots are being rushed back from the Afghan front to fly helicopters carrying soldiers who will toss 175-pound sandbags into the blaze with their bare hands. They hope to smother the fire by filling the reactor with tons of sand and boric acid, which neutralizes radiation. The first day, 110 sorties. The next, 300. The radiation level above the reactor is over 3,500 roentgens, almost 9 times the lethal dose. Some of the pilots make up to 33 flights in a single day.
Each time they went, they received 5 or 6 roentgens. If they were slow, it was even more. After a few missions, my soldiers would go wash up and eat. After a while, they'd start throwing up.
Since the crisis began, radiation victims have been sent to Moscow's Hospital No. 6. It has the country's only service that specializes in acute radiation sickness and illnesses linked to massive doses of radiation exposure. The initial symptoms of radiation sickness, vomiting, nausea, and diarrhea, are followed by a latency period. It's only later that much more fatal symptoms appear, such as deterioration of bone marrow and burns that eat flesh down to the bone.
When they arrived at the clinic, it was very hard, psychologically speaking. They came straight from the airport. Almost all of them were young. They arrived during the latency period. They felt fine. They were all dressed alike, wearing the same pajamas. They were making jokes. But we already knew that a lot of them were going to die. 27 of them died quite quickly. They'd all received huge doses of radiation and were suffering from life-threatening burns.
For 15 years, only these first victims will be acknowledged by the authorities. But many more will confront the devastating consequences of radiation exposure because the massive battle to contain the catastrophe at Chernobyl has only just begun. One week after the explosion at Chernobyl, a massive evacuation is finally underway. The close-by town of Pripyat and the larger city of Chernobyl, roughly 4 miles from the plant, are completely evacuated. So are all the villages within a 19-mile radius. 130,000 people are moved, many of whom have already been dangerously contaminated. An 1,150 square mile area along the border of Ukraine and Belarus is abruptly evacuated and isolated from the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continues to drift over Europe. It floats over Bavaria and northern Italy. Radioactive cesium-137 and iodine-131 rain down on the south of France and Corsica. Crops and pastures are seriously contaminated. While French authorities deny its presence, the cloud reaches Great Britain and spreads into Greece. In Chernobyl, the level of radioactivity continues to climb. 6,000 tons of sand and boric acid have filled the hole. But underneath this gigantic plug, 195 tons of nuclear fuel is still burning, giving off incredible heat that is gradually melting the sand. On the surface of the plug, cracks begin to appear.
Once we plugged up the hole, the temperature started to rise. We were afraid because it could have caused another explosion. It was terrifying. Scientists came to take readings. They were very worried. They were afraid the critical temperature would be reached and it would set off a second explosion. That would have been a terrible tragedy.
The cement slab below the reactor core is heating up and in danger of cracking. The magma is threatening to seep through. The water the firemen poured during the first hours of the disaster has pooled below the slab. If the radioactive magma makes contact with the water, it could set off a second explosion even more devastating than the first. The country's top experts are called into action.
If the heat managed to crack the cement slab, only 1,400 kilograms of uranium and graphite mixture would have needed to hit the water to set off a new explosion.
The ensuing chain reaction could set off an explosion comparable to a gigantic atomic bomb.
Our experts studied the possibility and concluded that the explosion would have had a force of 3 to 5 megatons. Minsk, which is 320 kilometers from Chernobyl, would have been razed and Europe rendered uninhabitable.
We had to stop the process. If it continued, it would have been an enormous disaster. An enormous nuclear disaster.
This second explosion would have been accompanied by a terrible shockwave and a massive rise in radioactivity that could have claimed thousands of lives in a matter of hours.
Thank God it didn't happen. There were trains with over 1,000 cars in Minsk, Gomel, and Kiev ready to evacuate the population.
The situation is critical. In Moscow, the State Commission decrees 2 emergency measures. First, send in a battalion of firemen to drain the water from under the reactor. They will later be declared national heroes, but will suffer from radiation sickness the rest of their lives. Second, seal the breach more effectively to bring the temperature down once and for all. In 2 days, General Antochkin's men will drop 2,400 tons of lead into the reactor.
When we started dumping lead in, the temperature went down right away. It absorbed well and sealed the hole as it melted, so there was less radiation.
But some of this lead melts when it hits the blaze and vaporizes into the atmosphere. 20 years later, traces of it can be found in the sick children of Chernobyl.
It's highly criticized today, but given the situation, there was no better solution. And all the people, military or civilians, officers or not, worked selflessly. I participated in this first stage, and I can tell you, it had to be done. It was harrowing.